Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me today is Mark Sleboda, an international relations and security expert based in Moscow, Russia. And today we're going to be talking about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So thank you so much for joining us live. This is your first live stream with us here at the New Atlas. Angelo couldn't make it, but maybe next time. How are you doing, Mark?
Brian, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be back on the new Atlas, and especially in the live format. Hey, everyone out there in live land, thanks for listening to me stand on top of a soapbox for the next hour or so.
We're happy for you to do so, and yes, thank you everyone for joining us this Friday evening for me here in Asia. Friday afternoon for you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. Please check the video description below for all of Mark's various platforms that you can find and follow his work. And without further ado, let's just get into what's going on. I want to I want to start with what the Western so-called analysts are saying. So this is the Institute for the Study of War. I think anyone who has been following your work or mine regarding analysis for Ukraine know that this is a very biased pro-Western source. And I just want to go over the three main points that they have put on their most recent update and then get your feedback on this. They say Russia is canceling parades for Victory Day on May 9th because they have no equipment to put on display. They're running so low on equipment, they cannot put together any parades. This is what they're saying. The next one, this is a literal quote. U.S. Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines stated that Russian forces are likely unable to conduct a significant offensive in 2023 due to munitions and manpower shortages, regardless of the success of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And finally, the Kremlin is attempting to increase the production quotas of military supplies despite reportedly, very important word there, reportedly lacking the necessary manpower. And then if you dig into the report, who reportedly said that, some opposition media, when you look at that source, they have no evidence at all whatsoever to substantiate that claim. So Mark, maybe let's start with the parades, the Victory Day parades, and then let's just go off from there.
Yeah, I mean, I read what the Institute of Study of War says, like I read the Washington Post and the New York Times. You know, I think it's better called the Nuland Kagan war propaganda outfit. I mean, because let's face it, that is what it is. You know, to give it FAW academic credentials is a stretch too far, in my humble opinion. Yes, Russia has canceled May 9th parades, particularly the Immortal Regiment March, which there's two different types of parades. First of all, May 9th is one of the two biggest, if not the biggest, holiday on the Russian year. The other one would be New Year's, which is obviously more of a festive occasion. It combines the gift giving of Western Christmas plus New Year's plus 4th of July all together. All right, so big holiday. The other big holiday on the Russian year is a military patriotic day, and it commemorates the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany and its European fascist allies in World War II. And it has long been kind of a galvanizing memorial institution for first the Soviet and now the Russian state. And it has to be said that it was as well widely celebrated in most of the rest of the former Soviet Union, minus the Baltics, and still is in several others. Although now we see, of course, Ukraine has started to penalize people who celebrate, Victory Day with the St. George orange and black striped ribbon that is the traditional a symbol of this day for decades since World War II now, and in the Baltics and in Europe as well. If you simply show those orange and black stripes, you will be arrested because freedom of the speech or something like that. Freedom of speech, right? I mean, let's be honest about that there, about what European states really are right now. So there is a military parade where the Russian military, puts its troops. It's a chance for the troops to, the young men who are serving their country to be seen by everyone and look shiny and specialized. And then, some military equipment rolls through. And the military equipment is mainly after the trauma, the national existential trauma of World War II, where the Soviet Union lost 30 million plus people. People like to be reassured that the state has the military force to protect them again. That is why this is held in this way. But in the last decade or so, a second parade has emerged, and this is the Immortal Regiment March. Now, previously, World War II veterans used to march as well. Obviously, there are only a handful of World War II veterans still left with us. My wife and I used to go to Victory Park on Victory Day, where a lot of the veterans would go, and we would hand out roses and carnations, which is red colors, which is traditional to the veterans there. But as the years go on, there are fewer and fewer veterans able to do that, of course. So the Immortal Regiment March is the Russian people carry placards, pictures, right? High res, old pictures, old framed pictures, whatever they have. And in a way, it has become kind of a modern state-centric patriotic icon, because there is this tradition of orthodoxy where the Orthodox Christian faith, where icons are a powerful element of this. They're pictures of their own family members or people close to them that sacrificed everything in World War II, have become the modern icons that they carry. And these marches attract millions of people, and it has spread everywhere, not just in Russia, but you can now find Immortal Regiment marches, at least before the last year, all over the world, right? I mean, there are Immortal Regiment marches in the US, in China, and Canada, right? Now, obviously, they won't happen, particularly in the West, everywhere this year. In the most recent years, I would say that the Immortal Regiments March people have started to make it, not just World War II, but the subsequent conflicts. Not that the Soviet Union was involved. I mean, so many. It was Afghanistan and Chechnya, which was internal. But now, of course, there is some people will start to carry the pictures of those lost in Ukraine. For the people in the Donbass, they've been fighting for 9 years now against the Westback Putsch regime in Kiev. Now that Russia has been officially involved with the intervention in the last year as well. But Russia has been canceling a lot of first of all, the Immortal Regiment marches are canceled across the West because of freedom of speech, right? But even Russia is canceling a lot of them, and those are being canceled more than the military parades is. This idea that Russia is out of military gear is absurd. I mean, it's just really, first of all, in these military parades, there is the big one in Moscow, but there are smaller ones throughout the country in most major cities. But even U.S. generals this week, in the last week, testifying before the Senate, have admitted that the Russian military is larger now than it was before the conflict began, that it has not significantly degraded. I mean, this is just pure propaganda. It's silly stuff. Yes. I guess we have to reply to it, but it's barely worth dignifying with that response. And let's be honest, at least in the first 6 or 8 months of the conflict, Russia was really keeping most of their best stuff out of the conflict because they didn't want to waste it on Ukraine, right? always in the back of the Russian government's mind is the possibility that this ends with direct NATO-Russia conflict. And that is still very much on the table. I think it gets more and more likely rather than less likely as we go on. So that is why Russia has always committed a relatively small force to what is involved still, compared to what they could, because they are still trying to signal that they want to limit escalation and they don't want a full-on direct war with NATO. But all of that attempts, in my mind, have been naive and proven wrong, because NATO keeps escalating and keeps escalating and keeps escalating. The one good thing about it, I guess, is they've run through all of their own artillery stockpiles. Italy just announced this morning that, hey, we're completely out of artillery and we got enough left to protect the country for like 2 days in event of a conflict. And they begged the U.S. To rearm them with artillery shells. And the U.S. said, get in line, because there's a queue, right? That should tell you something.
I just want to throw out there for people who haven't been following your work that you had been saying for quite a while before Russia did their first mobilization. You were saying that they needed way more troops involved in the special military operation. You were absolutely correct about that. So I just want to let people know that you got that right. And when you say that they're being naive or they're limiting themselves and they should be doing a little bit more or a lot more, that is probably also correct.
Yeah,
so
I've also been
please
saying
continue.
since 2014, and Putin admitted his mistake since then, that it was a mistake not to go in then as well. Trust, he's still got some latent Germanophilia, I think, or he did have it from his time spent in Germany, and was far too trusting of his European partners, as he liked to call them. So, I mean, there's no problem with military gear, right? That is, the parades only ever showcased a handful of items anyway, right? It's tokenism. So that's just silly stuff. The reason why the parades is canceled is because we have seen multiple terrorist bombings hitting civilians in Russian cities, right? That is why, because they don't want the carnage of hundreds of Russian civilians killed in the spectacle of these parades. That's particularly why, more than anything, the Immortal Regiment marches, the public parades where the public participates have been canceled, and likewise the military is one, because if there's one thing the Kiev regime can do, they can't win on the battlefield, not on any strategic or operational level. Yeah. With their counteroffensive, they can win, local tactical level. They can push through Russian lines in certain places and so forth. But what they can do, and what they will be doing increasingly, we're seeing it now, is asymmetric attacks, right? Attacks that are meant to sting, but primarily to generate headlines, because we've heard serious Western military academics talk about it, that from the very beginning of this conflict, the only hope of the Kiev regime and the West is that Russia's political will would collapse, right? That the original plan, which completely failed, was the existential economic war of sanctions, which was meant to destroy the ruble and crash the Russian economy and send the Russian people out into the street. Oh my God, we can't get at IKEA or McDonald's, get out of here.
That's right? It. Okay. Throw in the towel.
Yeah. All right. So obviously that didn't happen, and quite the opposite. That was a complete failure. The other thing has been to generate fear, right? To generate disinformation. This constant disinformation about Russian troop levels lost has been a big part of this war of the psyops, right? Because that is what it is. It is a psyops against the Russian troops in the field, against the Russian civilians at home, and of course to you out there listening, right? It's a battle for your minds, because that is part of the information spaces, in multi-domain operation theory. It's part of your brain, is part of the battlefield as well. And the goal has been to make Russia believe that they're losing, or to make Russian troops believe that other Russian troops are turning away from the front line, or that casualties are insane and Russia is attacking in human wave attacks and everything. And even in the most recent assessment they put out, this ridiculous, Russia has 100,000 casualties and 20,000 killed since December, right? And this is utterly absurd. And I'll tell you right away where you can tell it's propaganda. And then the reporters ask, well, what has Ukraine lost? What has the Kiev regime lost? I said, we're not going to talk about that. They're the victims, right? If you're putting out one number and not the other, you are obviously not putting out objective and neutral. It's part of the propaganda war. So if you believe those numbers, there are people who want to believe those numbers, of course, right? But at the end of the day, my always metric for judging how many, first of all, you keep your ears to the ground with Telegram, which, particularly in Russia, is very critical of the government. The Russian Telegram channels, the war bloggers assessing the combat, and there are some of those out there in English, right? Read Slavyangrad, Donbas, Devushka, if you don't speak Russian as well. And listen to some Ukrainian ones as well on Telegram if you can, read Ukrainian, because it's important to know, of course, what the other side is saying as well. But that is one way. The other way is to take a look at a serious Western source doing a fairly serious assessment of that. And that is the BBC, working with Mediazona and Meduza. And Mediazona and Meduza are two of these West-backed cutout outfits. They have always been essentially, information warriors, right? They're paid, they're directed to criticize the Russian government. The Russian, the 5% Russian liberals. That this is their representation. But they have done extensive searches, and I think you've talked about this before, Brian, as well, right? They are on the ground. They've got people on the ground in Russia. They're going around to soldiers, to veterans, their families' houses. They're going to cemeteries. They're checking all the public listings in newspapers all over the country, the social media. They're trolling everywhere, right? Like trawling. They're not even trolling in this case. They're gathering everything, and all they have been able to find at the last update I saw, maybe they've updated more recently, was about December. And for the entire conflict, they were only able to find not even 20,000 dead at that point, and that includes Wagner and the Donbas as well, right? Where actually. You have to remember that, particularly in the early 6 months of this conflict, it was primarily Ukrainians or former East Ukrainians who identify as Russian fighting other Ukrainians, and they suffered the heaviest casualties because they had already been fighting for some 8 years. Now, with the mobilization, there are more Russian forces in the field. But if they can't find more than that, and those numbers largely jive with what the Russian Ministry of Defense is putting out, then that's my metric for how many Russia has lost. All right, be a little pessimistic and figure, okay, maybe it's 10% higher than that, so forth, right? But if Western dedicated propaganda outfits that are actually looking into it and have some type of methodology can't find more than that, but you've got these, U.S. these the Pentagon putting, oh, Russia has 150,000 casualties, and Finland's they've got 200,000 casualties, and then you're like, well, what are your sources? Well, we're not going to talk about that. Well, their sources are the Kiev regime, right? I mean, that's but they're just repeating whatever the Kiev regime says, and that's what they're going with, even though they know it's ridiculous, because it's putting those numbers out is part of the propaganda war, which is why they never try to admit the rare slip-ups when they have admitted Ukrainian casualties, like von der Leyen. They quickly walked back and deleted posts and the like. And I seriously think that those were undercounts as well. So understand that that is a very much a big part of the conflict that is going on, and take everything that you hear with a grain of salt, including from the Russian side, right? I don't trust anything until I've heard multiple sources confirm it, and the Russian Ministry of Defense is not completely immune to it. Although I would say the way that I have seen, the Russian Ministry of Defense rarely outright lies. But then again, they don't outright say much at all, right? There's a lot of informational, operational discipline on the Russian side, right? They don't talk on TikTok, right? They don't talk on Instagram, reveal where their troops are and so forth. It doesn't
where they're going to launch their next offensive and what date and time.
When the Russian Ministry of Defense is going to lie, it's going to lie by omission. Right. That's where you look at. You look at what they don't say, or when they say something so completely vague, like the Moskva went down due to fires. Okay, yeah, okay. What caused those fires? Right. That's where the Russian Ministry of Defense is lies. Not so much the direct stuff. The Kiev will lie to your face 10 ways from Sunday and expect that you are so stupid and you're Western that even if you know that it's a lie, you will choose to believe it because it's the side you're on. That's the whole basis there. So that's why these parades are canceled, because they fear terrorist attacks. They fear these asymmetric attacks. And we've seen a huge increase in sabotage attempts. There was just this morning, there was the FSB stopped another assassination team that was going to be targeting the head of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. At the same day, we found out about the drone attacks on the Kremlin, which I regard as symbolic. We also found out that there was an assassination team targeting the governor of Crimea, Aksyonov, and that was thwarted. And there's every day you're hearing things like this in the Russian information space that don't make it to the Western mainstream media information space or headlines because they're not successful, because for the most part they're being stopped. Or in the cases of political assassinations, in the former East Ukrainian territories, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, that have been occurring for the last 9 years and ever increasing, because they don't care about those people. Those people are pro-Russians, right? They're all brainwashed, and it would be better their existence, for the last 9 years has been geopolitically inconvenient for the West, and they will happy to see them all go the way of the Odessa massacre, and the West will say, oh, it's not clear what really happened. Right. And we just did celebrate the 9th anniversary of the Odessa massacre. And right after it, Zelensky had the gall to go to the Netherlands and stand at The Hague and talk about justice for Ukraine. Where has the justice for the Odessa massacre been? The only ones who were ever charged and found guilty of anything were the victims, right? The handful of victims that survived, the anti-Maidan activists who weren't burned or beat and shot as they tried to escape the fire. Those are the only ones who were actually charged and tried with anything for generating unrest, right? The people who killed them, no one has ever been charged or tried. So, or what really happened on the Maidan, right? Because that trial has been going on for 9 years as well. And despite all the evidence showing that it was actually Perubi and his hired guns and neo-Nazis in the hotel overlooking the Maidan, that trial was never, of course, concluded because they couldn't put together a convincing story, because 90% of the witnesses say, yeah, actually the shots that hit us came out of that building there, which was the hotel controlled by the Maidan forces. So that's the justice for the 9 years of the shelling of the civilian areas of Donetsk, and before that, before they were driven back, Lugansk as well. And I take that personally. Full disclosure for those of you who don't know out there, my wife Yelena is from Crimea. We have family there in Simferopol, and we also have family all across East Ukraine, in the Donbass, in Kharkov, in Odessa, and the people, the big story, the big narrative that has been completely excised purposely from the Western media and government's account is the story of the people of East Ukraine for the last 9 years and continuing today.
Yeah, and a lot of Russian people have connections to Ukraine, family in Ukraine, in
Yes.
Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine. That is a very common thing. So it's not
it's
your family.
Yes. In East Ukraine and Western Russia, telling what is Ukrainian and what is Russian is impossible. Yeah. There's so much intermingling there. You know who said, the Russian president has been pilloried and tried, absurdly they try to present him as some type of modern day a genocidal figure for saying that Russians and Ukrainians are essentially one people, historically, culturally, linguistically. Do you know who else said that? Zelensky. Zelensky said that on the campaign trail. It's on YouTube. The video is still out there. He said war between us is unthinkable because Russians and Ukrainians are essentially the same people, right? He said that himself, right, before he inherited a regime that was built on West Ukrainian Banderite vanguard. And then, of course, I don't know, has it been Stockholm syndrome that he's internalized, what it was that has sustained the Maidan putsch to begin with, that brought it to power and has kept it there. Whatever has happened to him since, I don't know how the man can live with himself, to be perfectly honest, because he's from a ethnic, a mixed Russian Ukrainian ethnic family from Dnipropetrovsk in East Ukraine, right? Yeah, we all know that he can't possibly have neo-Nazi forces in his military and security services and throughout his government and be pilling medals on them because his daddy was Jewish, right? I mean, that's the I think the biggest brand management that they got with Zelensky, to whitewash and apologize away the nature of the underpinning ideology of Banderism that undergirds this regime. And that Banderite ideology institutionalized, brought into the military, the security services, the internal affairs, the mainstream Maidan political parties. Azov is the biggest and the best known. The national cores is their political movement, and one of the big canards that is always put out is that, the far right only gains a few points in election. Yeah, the actual far right parties, because most of the Ukrainian people are not far right. The majority of the Ukrainian people do not actually believe this, but they've hijacked the state regardless, and they're infiltrated throughout the main Maidan political parties. The rest of the party, the rest of the political parties in the country now all being banned, right? Everything that was not a Maidan party, all the the pro-Russian East Ukrainian parties, all of the leftist parties in the country, they've all been banned. Everything. I mean, the idea that they present this as a democracy is an obscene joke, right? But Parubi, that head neo-Nazi, the co-founder of the Svoboda Party, he is number 2 on Poroshenko's party, right? He visited and was feted by the Congress in the U.S. and Canada and the U.K. By the parliament there. So, I mean, they're infiltrated all through the mainstream political parties. And they have been called a neo-Nazi state within a state. And who called them that? 2019 or 2018 or 2019. Look it up. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty did.
Yes.
And back in a day when there was more honest reporting still about Ukraine, despite everything that was going on. So Azov, neo-Nazi state within a state, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, it's still up there. The Western media's 15-minute memory, of course, it has been excised from the narrative. But that is what continues to drive the regime in Kiev from today.
Yeah, and by the way, all of that talk about the similarities and ties between Ukraine and Russia, that's what actually got Zelensky elected. The Russian-speaking population
campaigned on peace.
Exactly. People wanted peace. It was a bait and switch. The other thing I want to point out,
West Ukraine, the population voted for Poroshenko. Take a look at the polls. It was the East Ukraine that voted for Zelensky because he promised peace. And when you get that kind of shell game, what can you do? Election, the managed democracy where I mean, I myself have always heard it said that elections under the barrel of a gun have no legitimacy. Well, elections in Ukraine since the Maidan have been held not just literally under the barrel of a gun, but under the shelling of Grad multiple launch rocket systems and neo-Nazi Azov and the dozens of other far-right battalion jackboots as well. During Zelensky's election, the election monitors in Ukraine, or at least among them, were Azov. They were officially election monitors in the country. So suddenly elections, where part of the population is literally, there's a war being waged against them by the regime that seized power in Kiev because they never accepted the overthrow of the government that they had democratically elected, but somehow those elections are legitimate. Get out of here. I mean, but
yeah. Yeah, I want to point something else out before we get into what's going on the ground, on the battlefields. People say, well, the far right, the Nazis, they don't have political representation. Their parties aren't in power in Kiev. But the problem is the parties that are in power, they have incorporated Azov officially in the Ukrainian military. They provide them a budget. They give them arms and ammunition. Yeah. So they're all complicit.
Not just that. If you take a look at the membership in the Duma, in the city councils of the people who are in the mainstream political parties, they are the far right. Right? Yes. They don't run in the far right parties. Only the direct militants of the organization do. Right? All of the people who used to be in Svoboda and all these other political parties, they joined Poroshenko's European Solidarity Party, or the former Timoshenko's Fatherland Party, or they're all West Ukrainian ultranationalist parties now, and still. Even in the last week, Zelensky is arresting Poroshenko's political people still because he's that much of a petty tyrant. Not because there has emerged any ideological difference between what Poroshenko was doing and what Zelensky picked up, but because he's a petty tyrant and he has a personal grudge against Poroshenko, even though he ended up doing the same thing and more as soon as he assumed power in the regime. And
Yes.
that has gone. Even Poroshenko, Zelensky, he charged the leaders of the two largest parties other than his own in the country, the Eastern Ukrainian opposition bloc and Poroshenko's European Solidarity Party, with treason. Right? He charged both of them with treason and had them both arrested. And Poroshenko was quietly released, but the charges never went away because the West complained about it behind closed doors. Hey, it's not a good look, and he did his job for us, so let him go. And he's decamped to Europe since then. Him and his family and his fighting age sons, of course. But the leader of the East Ukrainian opposition bloc, right? It took years for the Party of Regions, the party that had been elected in Ukraine, to reform after the lustration of the Maidan. They start building up strength again, finally, after years as the opposition bloc, and the head of their party is charged with treason. And then once the intervention began, they actually traded him a East Ukrainian politician, the leader of the political opposition in the country. They traded him to Russia in what was essentially a POW exchange, right? And it happened at the same time. So, I mean, obviously that's what happened. And then the it was that, of course, was completely ignored by, the Western media and excused away. And no one ever, why are East Ukrainian? Because there is no democracy. There is no freedom of anything in Ukraine. And there hasn't been, because the geopolitical flipping of Ukraine that occurred with the Maidan could never be allowed to be revisited again. So all political opposition in the country had to be squashed, right? They tried softer ways at first. The Communist Party was banned. The Party of Region was lustrated, and every leftist party in the country. But then they let the Party of Regions reform as the opposition bloc up until they became a threat again. And polls were showing them being the most popular party in the country. Then they shut them down. They charged the leader with treason. They completely shut down all media in the country that was critical of the Maidan regime, and still they present this as some type of freedom crusade, saving democracy in the world from Russia, and this other propagandistic obscene nonsense that has no relation to the reality of Ukraine today or for the last 9 years.
So this is a really good background. So the political facade that is Ukraine from 2014 onward, trying to camouflage it as an advance toward democracy, ignoring all of these transgressions internally, politically, against opposition, against media. What about on the battlefield? There's a facade taking place there as well. So I have some points here of recent things that have been going on. We saw the spokesman, I guess, or is he actually leading Wagner, Prigozhin, talking about a May 10th withdrawal from Bakhmut. But it's not as if they're giving up Bakhmut. They're claiming they're going to hand it over to Russian forces. I want to hear your take on that. And talk about the nature of the fighting. I talk about this all the time, but I want to kind of hear your take on this also. Ukraine's obsession, you kind of talked about it a little bit, the obsession with political optics and seizing territory versus the nature of the actual conflict, which is a war of attrition. And then maybe we can talk about the offensive, the different scenarios you see playing out, and maybe some points about these Western main battle tanks they think are going to change the tide of the fighting, and whatever else you feel is appropriate. Go ahead, Mark.
All right. So, I mean, I mentioned before, and Brian, as well as I do, of course, the Russian side does disinformation too, right? I mean, that's the nature of war. And yes. I mentioned that the Russian Ministry of Defense rarely lies outright and loudly. That's what Prigozhin is for. That's what Wagner's for. Okay. So anyway, if there's any pro-Ukrainian, I'm sorry, because it's not about Ukraine. There are tens of thousands of Ukrainians fighting against the Kiev regime and have been for 9 years. If there's any pro, West-backed Maidan Putsch people still out there listening after 40 minutes, could you scattle along now, because I'm gonna divulge a little Russian known but not talked about secret here. Prigozhin is an as well as being an effective founder, leader, if you will, at least in the PR sense of Wagner. He is the biggest vehicle for disinformation. Russian generals don't talk, right, to the press. They don't throw insults at Kiev, right? They don't play this game. That's what Prigozhin does. And if you believe for a second that a commander of Russian forces in the field, whether he is leading a PMC or an actual general, is allowed to say things like this that might showcase Russian weakness, if it was true, and telegraph it to the Kiev regime and the West and the world all the time, and not be removed, not be shut up, not have Putin call him up and say, "Hey, can it, or we'll get you out of there," then you're a chump. So take everything. It's not to say that everything Prigozhin says is false, right? Like any source of disinformation, a great deal of it has to be true. But all of this talk about Wagner not having enough artillery shells, about withdrawing because they need to lick their wounds, and all of this, and him yelling at Shoigu and yelling at the defense ministry, this is all theater. This is performance art. It's because Russia wants the Kiev regime to launch more of their upcoming offensive against the Bakhmut area than elsewhere, right? Because that's where they feel most they have a large assemblage of forces, on the flanks behind the lines, while Wagner is finishing off the urban assault. And this we're all out of artillery, so we're going to pull back after May 10th. Well, yeah, because the urban assault is done with, right? All but, and by then it will be. The Kiev regime controls 3 blocks left in Bakhmut. That is what they control. The most formidable being the Citadel, which is in the very south of West Bakhmut, the fringe that they have left, which is a number of tightly packed, tall residential buildings that they have turned into a fortress, right? So since very beginning, although they were told to shut up, Amnesty International has admitted that the Kiev regime turns every building and hospital and school into a base and firing point and so forth, which is a war crime. But we won't acknowledge that because all those accusations are geopolitical. They're not. They don't really have any legitimacy. And Amnesty International was told to shut up when they admitted this in the beginning. Well, this is has always been the case, and the Kiev regime has turned every single building, in the cities that they're defending into a firing point. Right, the Russian forces, Wagner, the Donbass forces, whoever, they have to go. Building by building, floor by floor, room by room. And let's be frank, this is what part of the whole problem that I always argued that Russia should have gone in 2014 is now the war is taking place in East Ukraine, and they have to destroy East Ukraine to get the regime out. That's the way they're fighting for it. And that sounds awful. That actually sounds like U.S. Vietnam propaganda in a way, except that the people of East Ukraine still support Russia there and want these people gone. And Russia is immediately beginning, as best they can, the rebuilding in Mariupol and everywhere since. But of course, at tremendous economic cost. But this citadel is the last, but they're not going to storm it. That's absolutely not needed. They're swinging around to the southwest around it to cut off the supplies to it. Once they run out of ammunition, then they won't. And if they don't, then they'll use the method they have been using elsewhere in Ugledar and Bakhmut. There are no civilians left there, so they will use the Sunsapyok, the TOS 1A thermobaric flamethrower, or the new, the Fab 500 or 250 glide bombs that Russia has started using to great effect. They'll just use those on the remaining and level it. That's what they're doing in Ugledar after several failed attempts to storm the tightly packed residential buildings turned into fortresses there. They're just destroying Ugledar building by building because there aren't any civilians left for them to worry about at this stage, where there have been at least until the last half a year or so. Prigozhin is opening his mouth and talking a lot of smack because Russia wants the Kiev regime to think they are weak there and they want to attack them there. Yes, they probably are going to pull Wagner out after May 10th because their job will be done. And until there is another urban assault needed, which is what Wagner specializes in, they won't be needed again until Kramatorsk or Slavyansk, which is probably half a year away, right? Or more. So they won't be needed, and they'll be sent, to the rear to regroup and get in more recruits and train and for the next stage. But they are a specialized urban assault force, and their job will be done in Bakhmut. And if they're trying to signal some type of weakness, there is going to be a rotation going on, which is always a potential moment to take advantage of when the other side needs or is about to do a rotation of troops. And also they're adding to it all this claims, we're being pulled back and we don't have enough artillery, and that's why artillery shells. That's all nonsense. There's nothing to support that from the battlefield, from the evidence of Wagner's use of artillery or the Russian military's use of artillery now in the flanks, because for the past 5-6 weeks now, Wagner was withdrawn just into Bakhmut, where the Russian main army took up the flanks, defending, the approaches to Bakhmut from the north and the south. So Wagner was left to just concentrate on what they're specialized on. And now that Bakhmut is done, they've earned their rest. But they've decided to make a little bit of political theater out of this to goad. I mean, Prigozhin has constantly been goading the Kiev regime forces and Zelensky personally. Don't withdraw your forces. Don't pull them out here. Stay and fight for the city a little bit more. He's been saying that for months, right? Because it was a meat grinder. It was a fire bag, whatever you want to call it. And the attrition rate, whatever the Western mainstream media may try to lie about it, was 8-1 to 10-1 in the Russian favor because of the overwhelming artillery advantage. It's an artillery war. No, Russia was not attacking in human wave attacks, not even with the Wagner members that were, former prisoners, who were, brought into Wagner for that specific, urban assault fortress. Yeah, they were fighting as urban assault infantry, but they were only sent in after everything was completely leveled for weeks ahead of a time with artillery and rocket systems and the like. There was no human wave attacks against heavily defended Ukrainian positions or lines before they had been softened as much as possible with artillery. That's just, it's playing to Western caricatures, also false, about the way that the Soviet Union fought in World War II. And it plays conveniently into the casualty disinformation that's being put out. So take everything that Prigozhin says with a grain of salt. Like I said, not everything he says is false. The same thing, Medvedev. Medvedev is the president and prime minister who was once known and hated by myself for being a neoliberal and not even much of a closet liberal, right? A Russian president who says his favorite band is Deep Purple, and it was seen in a video dancing to a popular tune at the song back in whenever American Boy. Come on, right? But since the firebrand Russian politician, the head of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which wasn't liberal, wasn't democratic, wasn't really a party, it was a cult of personality. But once Zhirinovsky died, they needed a new firebrand. And so they've rebranded Medvedev as the new Zhirinovsky. And he has been talking a lot of smack. And I have to admit, I find myself liking a lot of Medvedev says, except when he talks about nuclear weapons. And then I wish he would just shut up, because Russia's not going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, no matter what. It's just not going to happen. But he's the new Zhirinovsky. And the same way, if there's anyone talking smack and putting out disinformation on the Russian side, it's Prigozhin and Medvedev, right? They're the rabble rousers, if you will. So I'm not saying ignore what they say, because some of it will inevitably be true as the source with any bit of disinformation like that. But understand what you're dealing with, and if there's any pro-Kiev regime out there, you can come back now.
So Mark, I mean, I kind of suspect that it's a bit of a psyop also, but who's going to fall for it? I mean, of course, probably. Ukraine has to launch their offensive. Yeah. It looks like that could be a potential place where they launch it. Is this meant to target the psyche of the Ukrainian troops on the ground? So the commanders surely won't. Well, they'll be extremely cautious with this narrative, right?
Hey, the Pentagon, the quote-unquote Pentagon leaks, narrative management done through the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Politico, and the like, who are evidently the only ones who have the actual tranches of these supposedly leaked documents, right? That reveal to us almost nothing new information, right? Everything that has been released before, right? A lot of it, again, true in the nature of disinformation. Very few Russian analysts regard that as a serious, right? They feel that this was a crude piece of disinformation meant to lull Russian, where the disinformation included in the sweetener was about the disposition of Kiev regime troops, the level of training of individual units, where their ammunition and their artillery shells were located, and so forth. Did they believe that the Russians would believe it? Not really, but you make an effort, right? Russians certainly haven't fallen for it. But because of the nature of this conflict, with so much satellite information on both sides, right? Because Kiev gets everything straight from the U.S., the amount of effective signals intelligence, particularly on the Russian side, the amount of human intelligence, right? With the thousands of collaborators that the Kiev regime keeps rooting out and purging from their government bodies and the cities and everything. It's very hard, and the amount of drone reconnaissance and AWACS and their equivalents on both sides. It's very hard to do anything that you genuinely, on anything above the tactical level, can generate surprise in this conflict, right? Everything is telegraphed. You can see, we can't see it, but they can see it, right? Yes. They see the movement of troops, they see the movement of equipment and everything. Everything is telegraphed in advance. So you have to generate surprise when and how you can. And any little bit of disinformation that makes the other side doubt is worth playing on this side, whether it's the Pentagon leaks or whether it's Prigozhin talking, out of his butt.
What if those leaks from the Pentagon? What if that was them attempting to build some sort of off ramp for themselves. Although I can't see that they want to end this in any way. But what do you
I
say to
know there's
people
a lot of
who may
people
suspect that?
the lefty Russian camp that would like to believe that this is some attempt for the Biden administration to construct itself an off-ramp. I do not see it. I do not believe it. Mark Milley just, again, the second time this week, he said outright that a Russian victory in Ukraine would be the end of the rules-based order, i.e., U.S.-led Western global military hegemony. That is what they feel is on the line. How many times have we heard them trying to draw parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan and some type of modern domino theory that if Ukraine falls, then Taiwan will fall, and that's it, right? The holds that the U.S. had to contain, to pressure, to weaponize against Russia and China. It's two, near peer adversaries. It would be gone, and that would be, the end game. If they believe that, they will keep throwing whatever they can and have in. Look at a good way to look at what I don't have rosy-eyed views about the end of this conflict. I don't believe it will ever really end, not in our lifetimes. We may see periods of frozen conflict, temporary armistices and ceasefires, at some point. I don't think anytime soon, but even that will just be temporary. All right. I think Ukraine will be it is the proverbial Humpty Dumpty that was pushed off the wall, that being the internal-external balance between Ukrainian national identity conception and geopolitics, east side of the country, west side of the country. Once that fell, you can't put it back together. So, and any partition of the country will whatever lines those are, will never be accepted permanently by the other side. So I don't have any rosy-eyed views about the end of this conflict, and even what a Russian victory would look like doesn't look like what I think a lot of people might hope that it looks like. But take a look at what Russian victory in Syria looks like.
Exactly. Yeah.
U.S. permanently occupying East Syria to deny the ability of Syria to reconstruct, right? And also, always as this idea that they're somehow, by camping out there, they're somehow inhibiting Iran and so forth. Although I never bought that as a only stupid neocons who have no idea of the way militaries work, think that kind of thing. But that is the Russian victory, with still the Syrian government only in control of about 70% of the country, with Turkey still occupying all of North Syria and still not giving any indication that they're willing to give that up. Right? They actually still expect to argue, we'll normalize relations with Damascus as long as you make all of North Syria and Idlib our little autonomous region that we may pretend still is part of Syria, but everyone agrees that it's really run out of Ankara. That's their game there, and the U.S. never obviously intends to pull out of East Syria as well. Not until some radical change in U.S. politics, which I don't see as possible. In again anytime soon, right? Maybe 20 years from now. Like with Afghanistan, something like that. But that is what victory. Even if this offensive, the Ukrainian offensive fails, to achieve success, whatever that looks like, because no one has ever firmly defined what Ukrainian success with this offensive looks like. I don't believe in their success. I think it will be a hard-fought, bloody battle, but I don't believe they're going to take Melitopol. I don't believe they're going to divide the land bridge. I'm actually more worried about them taking Energodar and the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant with a swing crossing of the Dnieper amphibiously, which they've demonstrated the ability to do in the last few weeks, at least on some level, and then a sharp swing down from Zaporozhye, but then cutting the flank there. And if they can drive Russian forces, then they can come down around a lot of these fortified lines in northern Zaporozhye and just do an end run, like the Nazis, the original Nazis anyway, around the Maginot Line, right? Whether that will be successful, I can't say, but those are the things I worry more about than them successfully charging echeloned Russian defense across the open steppe of Zaporozhye towards Melitopol. Let's say that it's successful. Let's say it's not successful. What after that? Everyone says that NATO can't continue. They can't sustain another offensive after this. Take that with a grain of salt. I don't believe that they can sustain another offensive, but does that mean they're going to stop providing what aid they can as they can provide it? No. And it may be less than it is now. Let's say that the counteroffensive, it's actually an offensive. I myself started using that counteroffensive nonsense because the Western mainstream, everything Ukraine does has now been redefined as a counteroffensive in defiance of what the words offensive and counteroffensive actually mean in military terminology. Let's say it doesn't succeed by any measure, and then Russia. I don't think Russia has enough forces on hand to then begin a major, certainly not a big arrow offensive after that. And I continue to worry that Russia has not launched new waves of mobilization, which makes me afraid that the Kremlin may be planning then to go negotiations and some type of bull feces Minsk 3, which the Russian people will very much be against. But until I see more rounds of mobilization, then I don't believe that Russia intends to move further into Ukraine after this is over. But if the offensive fails and they can't support another offensive immediately, does that mean that they look for an off-ramp and get out and just surrender and say, Russia, okay, you've got Ukraine, unconditional surrender, or you've got Ukraine up to the Dnieper, right? No. They continue supporting what they can, and the Kiev regime goes on the complete defensive then, without even talking about offensive for maybe a year or 2 or 3 or whatever it takes. And if Russia does sign something, it doesn't mean anything. We've already seen that. They signed the Minsk Accords too. They signed the February 21st agreement. They signed the JCPOA with Iran. They signed the Short Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty. Nothing that they sign is worth wiping your butt with. I'm sorry. They have said outright, they keep saying it again, as soon as this conflict is over, we'll bring Ukraine into NATO. As soon as this conflict is over, we'll provide them with F-16s and all the Abrams they can send them. Why should Russia ever agree to negotiations then, unless they're so afraid, which I think they still are, of direct conflict with NATO at some point. I think either they continue supporting the regime at a lower level, or if Russia then looks to escalate big, then they send a coalition of the willing troops, U.S., Poland, the Baltics, the U.K., Romania, whatever, as peacekeepers into West Ukraine, possibly to Kiev, and the worst case scenario into Odessa. to preserve a port city for a Ukrainian rump state. And they're all that Russia has been trying to avoid by limiting their escalation throughout this conflict. All the signaling they have tried to do and has been completely ignored by Western governments and media, that our intentions are limited. Just, this is what we said, and if you'll just do that. No, they have never had any intention of occupying all of Ukraine, not even all of East Ukraine. They never even wanted Zaporozhye and Kherson. It kind of fell into their hands because of their abortive strategy, these thunder runs and intelligence in the beginning of the conflict. And you saw them retreat away from Kherson City and Kharkov in the north when they did it. Here's the problem with territorial occupation in this conflict. That's the war that the Kiev regime is fighting, but from their side, maybe it makes sense. Because it is, or the Kiev regime believes that it is their country anyway. Russia has been fighting a war of attrition. If you take over territory, you have to defend it, right? That is a major manpower draw. And certainly in the beginning of the conflict, in Kherson City and Kharkov, Russia didn't have that manpower until the mobilization of reservists in last autumn. There are also huge economic costs. You are economically responsible for the people living there, and you assume that the economy is all but non-existent. So there is a huge cost there as well. So you lose and the opening up potential territory for more guerrilla and sabotage attacks and the like. There is a huge cost to taking territory, which is why Russia has been trying to fight this war of attrition instead of a war of territorial conquest, because they never wanted to conquer Ukraine. They would have preferred a better government in Ukraine, if they believed that any, piece of paper that Kiev signed that, we won't join NATO would have ever, settled things at the end of this conflict, then they're as naive as they were when they signed the original Minsk Accords. So I don't know there, but there is a problem by not taking territory as well. And that is, the Kiev regime can continue press ganging, forcibly constricting people for still a couple years easily into the future. They're having problems with it. But if you take a look at the regional spread of the Kiev regime's forced conscription into the military, it is overwhelmingly towards areas that are Russian speaking: Odessa, Kharkov, and to the Hungarian ethnic minority, which have always, at least, in terms of elections, they've been anti-Kiev and pro-East Ukraine electorally, because they also are an ethnic minority in the country. That they can continue to do that. They can continue to forcibly constrict large numbers of manpower, go on the defensive. The West can continue so that Russia has to take every city building by building and city by city. I don't believe they will ever give up. I do not believe that they will unconditionally surrender. If they did, I don't think it would mean anything. That's why I have no clear idea what a victory for the Russian side looks like in this conflict. And that's not me blackpilling and saying I'm against the Russian government. I'm not. Jesus. Right. That is me being a fatalist and a realist and a cynic about where this ends. And let's say that Russia did take all of East Ukraine, brought home all, the majority of the population there, varying levels as you go further west, willing to, either happy or willing to accept that. But the economic cost then of rebuilding a war shattered East Ukraine is huge. Russia, that is outside of Russia's economic possibilities, right? To be honest, I mean, it would mean a huge national reprioritization of the economy. And anyone who believes that China is just going to gift us, I mean, however strong the strategic partnership is, they're still really cutthroat businessmen, right? They're not just going to hand over tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions, without serious concessions to rebuild East Ukraine either. So I don't have a clear idea where this conflict ends, which is why I don't believe it does. Right? Whether that's with a Kiev regime fighting on after this offensive fails for years, or with the West moving into West Ukraine directly. Yeah, I don't have any type of rosy projection, which doesn't mean I don't think it should be fought. I think it should be escalated. I think Russia needs to call NATO on their escalation, and maybe hope that they restrict movement of NATO forces into just West Ukraine, because to be perfectly obvious, honest, I think a Russian occupation of West Ukraine, where they really do hate Russians, would be a disaster, right? The Soviet Union and 50 years of the Soviet Union couldn't get the banderism out of West Ukraine. Certainly the relatively passive and soft Putin is not capable of getting the banderism out of West Ukraine. But whatever Ukraine is left, at whatever end this comes through, NATO is going to arm it as a weapon against Russia into the future. They're going to train entire generations of whatever rump state youth is to be an anti-Russian vanguard. And Russia can't, unfortunately, erase all of it. This is the truth of geopolitics that Russia has realized with Belarus in the West. To the U.S., a neutral, an idea of a neutral border ground between Russia and NATO was no longer acceptable. A neutral Ukraine, which Ukraine was by their constitution up until 2014, not allowed to join foreign military blocs, was no longer acceptable. They made an abortive attempt to geopolitically flip Ukraine in 2005 with the Orange Revolution. 2 years prior to that with the Rose Revolution as well. This was a more thorough measure against Ukraine, and they don't intend to back away from it. Russia has realized that there are no gray spaces left on the map. If you don't take those spaces, then the U.S. will weaponize them against you, right? Finland, not allowed to be neutral anymore, brought into NATO. There are no neutral. They're grabbing. They know what geopolitical window, the 10 to 15 years they have until they can no longer do this type of thing. And they're taking full advantage of it now, which is why Russia, once had a very loose union state with Belarus and is now bringing them further into the fold after the very early sprung and very poorly organized attempt to overthrow the Belarusian government during Lukashenko's last elections there, where the whole thing was Russia realized that if we let Belarus be flipped, it will be weaponized against us, just like Ukraine. And
exactly,
that's the truth. And already the U.S. is getting involved in Georgia, and the Samantha Powers and USAID are now looking at reinforcing their own bloc and deploying in Hungary. So that's the game now, and I think the Chinese really need to pay attention. And if you'll see how much South Korea and Japan are now being brought into the Ukraine conflict, and NATO having run out of stocks and not able to effectively artillery shell arm Ukraine going forward, they're now talking up the new pro-American president of South Korea, Yoon. He of the American Pie song. If for those of you who caught that, if there's anything more sycophantic, they're pressing him to deliver arms to Ukraine directly. What he has been doing is simply giving it to Poland, selling it to Poland, or selling it to Greece, and then they've been transferring it, or their own equivalents, on to Ukraine. They're doing the same thing now with Japan. And the Philippines just opened 4 new American military bases under Marcos Jr. And the U.S. is pressing Japan to put short-range ballistic missiles on the southern Japan islands. So they are trying the same thing there, and the Chinese had better wake up and realize how much is on the line, and it's on the line now. And hopefully, they are providing more support to Russia behind the scenes, or at least are ready to, because it's all geopolitically coming down now in the next and for the next 5 years.
I think you said it though. I mean, people in the comment section, they're saying how bleak this is, but this is realistic. Right. This is very realistic. This is what's happening. The U.S. is ruthless. This is their last shot. This is the window of opportunity closing. They're all in. Just like you said, no one's allowed to be neutral. You're either with us or you're against us. And they're making their big move everywhere in Eastern Europe in general, and in the Pacific. We can see this happening. But at the same time, we see NATO depleting their land force, what they have for land forces, and they're saving up everything that they will need for a potential conflict with China. So everyone is kind of hunkering down, and trying to, and Russia also. So this is where we are, and people who think this is going to be over like this year or next year, I mean, no, it's not. This is something that is going to continue grinding on, and we still have to wait for the U.S. to do whatever it's going to do regarding China, using the island province of Taiwan as their proxy of choice.
In order to occupy just the rest of East Ukraine, right? Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa. Russia will need at least 500 to 600,000 more troops. Until I see the next wave of mobilization in Russia, right? And I'm not talking about manly recruitment ads and Wagner recruitment and the like. Until I see that, and Russia has it. Russia at the beginning of this conflict had 2 million reservists available to call up, even before it even started looking at anything civilian, right? And of course that self-regenerates a couple 100,000 every year with the new draftees serving their 1 year of military service and so forth. And they've only pulled up 300,000 of them. There's another 1.7 million reservists at least that could be called up at this point. And whatever they may say, I know one of the big attempts to disinfo this recent symbolic attack on the Kremlin. No, it wasn't a serious attempt to assassinate Putin, but it was part of a symbolic, we're hitting the Kremlin, we're hitting the Russian flag tower, and Russia still has to treat it like an attack on the head of state, just like the U.S. would if someone flew a drone into the White House, right? They would invade several countries after that, right? But it's that is part of this disinformation project. It is about the symbolism, and the whole hope of Ukraine from the beginning has been trying to make the Kremlin politically give up this fight, that they couldn't win a long war of attrition. And I don't mean the conflict ends this year. It doesn't. I know there have been some military analysts on our side who last February said, oh, this will be over in 2 months. And, Russia will run over Kiev, and then, it'll be over by the fall. And now it'll be over by late summer or by the end of the year. And from last February, I said it would be a forever war. And which didn't mean that I didn't think it didn't need to be fought. I absolutely did. But I just have a very cynical, fatalist, realist perspective over, what that really means in military terms, in economic terms, in political terms, and it all goes together.
Yeah, and I think comparing it to Syria is appropriate, and we see how long that's dragged on. We can see how it's been managed and how it is in favor of Russia, Syria, Iran, and how things are tilting in their favor. But it's a very incremental, long-term process, and I believe it's going to be even a longer-term process in Ukraine because the stakes are so much higher and everything is on such a larger scale. People act as if this is
so much more is at stake.
Yeah, exactly. And Ukraine, when you look at Ukraine versus, say, Iraq, the U.S. went into Iraq with many more troops. It's a much smaller country geographically in terms of population. Russia went into Ukraine, a much larger country with a larger population, a better trained, better equipped military with fewer troops. This is something people have to understand, the scale of what's going on in Ukraine. And it is not just as easy as just moving across the map as I think some people may wish it was. So we're coming up to about the 1.5 hour mark. I think we covered a lot of ground.
Should we mention this drone, this Bayraktar over Kiev?
Yes, let's do that. Because some people are saying, well, was the drone attack on the Kremlin, was that a false flag? No, it isn't. Everything Ukraine has done since 2014 onward has been to provoke Russia. This is no different.
The Russian government has so much domestic support, right? The recent polls out, 80% support for the military state. Russia does not need anything to provide political capital, to provide a justification for the escalation. The Russian people want, right? Not all of them, of course, but a majority of the Russian people want the Russian government to escalate now and to get this over with faster. They don't want any more drawn out periodic humiliations and psyops. They want this done. And if we're going to do it big, do it loud, do it quick, and get it over with. That's the way the Russian people think. And, they trust Putin, but at the same time, they are more than willing, right? There will always be the 5%. You saw, oh my God, 100,000 Russians fled the country when Russia called up the mobilization. Yeah, that's the 5%, the Russian liberals they left. Most of them were never going to be subject anyway because they haven't done military service. They're not reservists anyway. 99% of those who fled would never be called up anyway. Those aren't the Russian patriots. Those are the Russians, the 5% who wish they lived in Europe. Right. And a lot of them left the country, which is why actually there have been so few protests and the like. It's been very quiet in Russia for the last year. Those of us who were really sick of the 5% are quite happy with that state of affairs. They self-left. Great. Problem solved. So what
was not a false flag. They didn't need
it was not a
false
flag.
And they haven't capitalized on it either.
Yeah, the big question is, was it launched by a behind the borders team, right? Remember, there's 5 million Ukrainians living in Russia, right? Some 3 million of them refugees just from the last year, and then refugees from previously, and lots of Ukrainians who have always lived and work here, right? It's real easy. It's almost Russia. The FSB is working really overtime, and the amount of stuff they catch that you don't hear about unless you're, paying very close attention to the Russian news, they're stopping a lot, but they can never stop anything. The same thing with these small drone attacks, just like the Kiev regime. When you're launching drones with small drones, right? These small, commercial pro or, kamikaze drones, they got really small radar signatures. They're really hard to stop, no matter what you're using. Particularly over widespread areas, right? Yeah, they'll always be able to hit an oil depot here and an oil depot there because you can't protect everything in a country, either Russia or Ukraine side. That's just a facet of modern warfare, and you have to start allocating for a certain amount of write-off. You defend what is most important, how you can, but they're going to get stuff through. They're going to get sabotage teams through. You're going to see more of it. Right. The big thing I'm looking for in this offensive, other than, again, I fear an amphibious crossing towards Energodar in the south, but is these pinpricks, these sabotage attacks, these dirty tricks, assassinations, things like that. That's what I've been talking about for weeks now. And they generate headlines. They generate panic. They're meant to generate the perception that Russia is losing or Ukraine is striking back, Kiev is striking back, and they will continue. So this incident, was it something long range launched by Kharkov from Kharkov, which is the closest that they could possibly reach? We know that's the very limit of what they have demonstrated they're capable of doing so far. We did see several mysterious drones run out of fuel and crash outside of Moscow as obviously trial runs in the week beforehand. Or was this something launched by a sabotage team locally from within Russia? We don't know that yet, right? We don't know. They know, or the Russian government knows, but they haven't released that information yet. But there was an incident just last night at the time of taping where a Bayraktar TB2 combat drone, Turkish provided, was seen flying over Kiev. And there was immediately a lot of talk about this. There was a lot of attempts in the Ukrainian media and Telegram channels to present this as some type of, they tried to say it was a Russian Corsair, which is a reconnaissance drone anyway, but similar in shape and profile. You'll remember there was a lot of talk about the TB2s, about the Bayraktars at the beginning of this conflict.
Game changer.
They were the miracle weapon, the game changer and everything. And then Russia, once they got over this initial thunder run mistakes and started sending into their BTG offensive defensive formations that are protected, they have heavily a lot of offensive firepower, the artillery, the rocket systems, right, the like. But what people don't mention is they also have huge defensive power. They have mobile, a physical shield of air defense that goes with them, but they also all have a mobile shield of electronic warfare that goes with them as well. Really effective units. So 2 layers of protection against precision strikes and aircraft and the like over them. And once they settled into that, once the electronic warfare units were able to catch up and they they formed normal BTG and offensive lines in East Ukraine, all the Bayraktars disappeared. Right?
Yeah.
You never heard anything about them again. And Forbes ran an article in December quoting actually a paper from the RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, that said that the Kiev regime started this conflict with thousands of Western provided drones, and that by the end of the summer, by September, the Kiev regime had lost, not according to us, according to them, 90% of their drones, most of it due to Russian electronic warfare. 90%. They called it a drone massacre. Not me. They did. The Royal United Services Institute and Forbes. But they reported it, but they left it out of the narrative. It wasn't allowed the way they changed about things. So that's why you never heard about the Bayraktars again. They've only got a couple of them left. Evidently, one of them was seen flying above Kiev, and there was talk that maybe it was a Kiev regime false flag to try and say, oh, Russia then tried to assassinate Zelensky, even though everyone knows that Zelensky is afraid to return to Ukraine at the moment. And he went from Finland to an unscheduled trip to the Netherlands, and there's no word about when he'll need another reassurance from Naftali Bennett that Putin won't target him before he comes back to the country, probably, or they'll smuggle him in by train through Poland or something like that. So eventually they had to admit they shot down their own Bayraktar flying above Kiev. And there's all kinds of hilarious videos out there of people in Kiev, young men leaning out their windows with double-barrel shotguns. And even I saw machine guns that they must have acquired somewhere off of vehicles that they had in their not military, like civilian guys, leaning out their windows trying to shoot down the Russian drone. Well, eventually their own military shot it down, and they had to admit that they're the ones who did it because there was too many videos of this thing out there for them to cover up. And they say, this is what the Kiev regime Air Force put out officially, that they lost control of it. Now, that's very interesting. Now, Russian electronic warfare can and regularly does hijack drones, right? They can ground them, they can block GPS signals, they can also replace them and land them and take control of them. But that's way too far outside the range of anything that I know that Russia is capable of. But I have since heard suggestions there in the Russian Telegram channels that someone in the DPR is claiming to have hacked it. And I can't at this moment confirm that. It's not what I would consider firm information, but I mention it because it does seem the most likely explanation of what occurred, why the Kiev would lose control of one of their own combat drones and have to shoot it down over their own capital city. It's the
Very
best
odd
explanation that makes sense to me as well, but take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and it was an air defense missile that took it down. So they lost one of their last remaining drones, and they used an air defense missile that is in very short supply to shoot it down. So we're talking about a war of attrition, and I mean this is Ukraine doing Russia's work for them. Yes, Mark.
One thing we brought up, we've been told again that they have a shortage of air defense missiles. They don't have many left, and they don't have the ability to replace them. And I believe that that's largely true. But one of the things that has started to occur to me as Prigozhin has done his theater and say, oh, I don't have any artillery shells, and please don't attack Bakhmut, right? Right now when I'm rotating out with no artillery shells, is that the West very well could have not revealed the equipment or the level of equipment that they provided to the Kiev and various things as well. They could have said that they sent so much of something and sent far more of it. And they could have had hidden stockpiles or gotten them from third countries that we don't know about. So be prepared that whatever you do an excellent rundown all the time of these these packages that are sent. But I've started to fear that what is said in those packages at this point could be also a vector for disinformation as well. So be prepared for the unexpected in this offense.
People should keep an open mind to that. There were weapon systems and munitions that they did send that they didn't announce. I think the anti-radiation missiles. Yeah, exactly. But one thing we do know for sure is that Russia is using its military aviation more freely along the line of contact. I think that is a direct result of dwindling air defense systems, at least along the line of contact. So I think we're at the 1.5 hour mark. I think we'll wrap things up. I see many people in the comment section asking about Gonzalo Lira. I've tried to contact him. I've not gotten an answer back from him. I have no idea what's going on with him.
I feel really bad now.
Yeah, well, people shouldn't speculate about what's going on. He has disappeared for a couple of days, like 2 or 3 days before, because he wasn't well, he wasn't feeling well, or something like that. So I'll continue trying to contact him. I'm sure others will, and we'll try to figure out what happened to him. Don't jump to conclusions and don't speculate, because that doesn't help at all.
I did a roundtable with him a couple weeks ago. It was just me and him, not really round, I guess. And at the very end of it, when we were signing off, off screen, I said, "Hey, we're friends, I guess, online friends." I said, between you and me, I hope you have a way of getting out of there really quick if you need to. And if you don't, then get one. And then he's like, yep. I mean, he doesn't want to really answer because, of course, if they care enough, the Kiev regime people could always be, SBU could always be listening to him. But now I'm like, boy, I hope it's probably not, but yeah.
Well, no, I mean, but the thing is that's a very difficult position that he's in. This is something that the Western media was when they thought something had happened to him initially. You had people in the Western media celebrating it. Some of these creatures celebrating it, and this just goes to show you the true nature of this entire conflict and what is actually being fought for here. And I think people should keep that in mind. So again, as soon as I have any information at all about Gonzalo Lira, I will let everybody know. I will continue trying to contact him. I'll talk with other people behind the scenes who.
My own family got out of Kharkov 8 months ago. So.
Yes. Very important to get out when you can, because when things start to go wrong, it's very unpredictable, and things that you imagined would have been possible are actually extremely unrealistic when things start to actually unfold. So always err on the side of caution, always be prudent, even if it didn't seem like a necessary at the time.
Who thought that they would reach out and kill Daria Dugina or Vladen Tatarsky? And they did, and the Western media just excused and
shrugged it off
and said they probably deserved it. They were Russians or pro-Russians, and so they deserved it. That was it. And they will do the same things to any one of us. I'm just luckily, I'm a lot lower profile than Vladen Tatarsky, and you're relatively safe in Thailand, although that could change in the near future.
Very, very soon, yeah. I'm going to be covering that. That's going to be a lot of extra work coming up. Just got to keep on doing what we got to do. There's a lot at stake. Even though, Mark, you said some pessimistic things, but I agree, and I continuously warn people this is a long-term conflict. We have to continue. The world's shifting to multipolarism. This is something we all have to try to contribute to and invest in, and we have to just keep on keeping on, because the West and their unipolar world order are going to try to reassert themselves at all costs, and it's going to be a combination. It was built by a combination of people over a long period of time. It's going to be dismantled the same way. So we just got to keep working toward it. Mark, I want to thank you so much for taking an hour and a half out of your Friday to join us. I want to thank everyone in the comment section who joined us this Friday. Please check the video description below for everywhere you can find and follow Mark's work. And Mark, is there anything that that you're particularly focused on? Telegram or I follow you on Telegram primarily.
I'm doing this week. I did like 12 or 13. I still got one more. Radio interviews on Sputnik. I can't possibly put them. I put several a week out on my Substack.
Yeah, they're really good too. People should go and listen to them.
And Brian's are as well, because he's been picked up a lot more recently too. But I put everything either on my Substack or Telegram. I do a lot on Twitter or Facebook. I don't even bother anymore. They're so censored there. But my YouTube channel, The Real Politic with Mark Sleboda, I'm a little behind on the video editing there. It's very time consuming to do a lot of visuals and so forth. But I'm getting back up started with that, hopefully as well. But yeah, Telegram and Substack, besides that, are the best ways to follow me. I have had people try to pledge me money on my Substack, even though I don't have it opened for receiving money. You cannot send me money. I have a Russian bank and a Russian credit card. I don't have a Western credit card account. There's no way that you can send me money or that I can take it. I'm very appreciative of those people who have tried, but cryptocurrency, all right, no, none of that actually works. You can't, so don't give it to me, give it to Brian.
Like, anyway, Putin pays you quite a stipend, so you don't need to worry about it.
That's why I still have to teach for a living, right? If only, only our information war was as well funded as their information war. But please support the New Atlas and other similar channels out there, but primarily the New Atlas.
Yes, and thank you for that, Mark. And we're going to try to get you back on a lot more often. I think I want to try to bring in guests with Angela and myself every Friday if we can. And I'd like you to be one of those guests that come back very often. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone in the comment section. I'll look through all the comments and maybe do a question and answer next week or something. So thanks again, and until next time, bye for now.